Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the McGowan Theater located in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. I'm Doug Swanson. I'm the Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Museum, as well as the producer for the Noontime Lecture Series. Today's Noontime Author Talk is being presented in conjunction with our exhibit, Making Their Mark, Stories Through Signatures. Making Their Mark features original signatures from our nationwide holdings, They illustrate the many ways people have placed their signature on history, from developing a signature style to signing groundbreaking policy into law. The stories in these records, many of which have never been seen by the general public before, of famous and infamous individuals, are all part of our nation's history, and each one made their mark on the American narrative. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that the U.S. military personnel in all branches of service during World War II certainly made their mark, not only on our nation's history, but on world history as well. The exhibit will be open until January 5th of 2015 and is located in the Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery on the main exhibit level. I hope you join us on Thursday, July 10th at noon for a program on Washington Civil War forts and parks that will also function as the kickoff for the official commemoration of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Fort Stevens. On Wednesday, July 16th at noon, author Christian McBurney will be on hand to discuss his Revolutionary War book, Kidnapping the Enemy, the Special Operations to Capture Generals Charles Lee and Richard Prescott. To find out more about these and our other public programs and exhibits, please take one of our monthly event calendars, which you'll find in the racks in the theater lobby, or else you can visit us at our website, which is www.archives.gov/calendar. Our topic for today is South Pacific Cauldron, World War II's Greatest Forgotten Battlegrounds by Alan Rems. Mr. Rems is a graduate of the NYU School of Commerce and received his CPA degree from New York State. Having grown up during World War II, he developed a strong lifelong interest through study in all aspects of the war. 12 years into retirement from his work as a CPA, Alan began researching the mysterious death of a leading Marine general in the South Pacific in 1943. He submitted his discoveries to Naval History magazine, and this first writing effort earned him an Author of the Year award for 2008 by the U.S. Naval Institute for his article. Since that time, he has contributed 7 articles and 2 book reviews to naval history. South Pacific Cauldron is his very first book. Please join me in welcoming Alan Rems to the National Archives.
Thank you, Douglas, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you all for coming out today and hearing my talk about World War II in the South Pacific. And hopefully I can whet your appetite that you might care for the purchase of the book later. James Jones, the author of From Here to Eternity, was a veteran of the war in the South Pacific. In the 1970s, he wrote about those battlefields. He called them places that people in the United States mostly never heard of. He was talking about such places as the Drinamore River on New Guinea, about Munda on New Georgia, about Hellzapoppin Ridge on Bougainville, about Manus in the Admiralties, and Suicide Creek at Cape Gloucester. In the 40 years since he wrote, the South Pacific has faded even more with the deaths of most of those who served there. And these people include the Marine who appears on the book cover. We know who it is. His name is Corporal William Cochran of Flint, Michigan. He's shown here serving with the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion on D-Day at Bougainville. Now, the Marine Raiders were considered elite troops, and I was interested in knowing a little more about him. Well, I found out that Cochran died something like 7 years ago, but I was able to track down his son. However, his son could not tell me anything. He said his father never talked about the war. When even the children of our servicemen don't know their story, we know that an important part of the past is slipping away from us. Even the setting is largely forgotten. For most people, South Pacific, those words only mean those lush tropical islands in the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical. However, there are a few enchanted evenings, in a very different region that we're talking about. This is it. The war zone to the east, on the right, you see the chain of the Solomon Islands, and on the west, you have the lower half of New Guinea. This was one of the worst World War II regions where men lived and fought, with towering mountains, treacherous razorback ridges, disease-ridden jungle, vast swamps, infernal heat, and torrential rainfall. Survival there was challenging enough even without the perils of combat. From that war zone, only one place, Guadalcanal, has remained etched in America's memory. As the scene of our first World War II offensive, it naturally caught the attention of the public. Afterwards, things changed in the South Pacific. It was a war of slow, grinding battles that were hardly material for dazzling war reporting. And public attention shifted to the more spectacular and bloodier fighting in the Central Pacific that began at Tarawa and continued thereafter at such places as Kwajalein and Eniwetok, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, and then ultimately to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. James Jones said this about the South Pacific after Guadalcanal. They had a year of battles fought without any great victories to stimulate troop morale. Short, sharp, costly fights, each of them, which got scant publicity at home. Now, what he's saying about publicity, that was right on. However, what he said about there being no great victories, that was dead wrong, because in a period of just 9 months, the Allies wrested away control of the South Pacific from the Japanese, neutralized their great base of Rabaul, and opened the way to the heart of the Japanese Empire. However, that was not the end of the war in the South Pacific. There were still thousands of Japanese that were still back there, and they mounted great counteroffensives on Bougainville and on New Guinea that are among the least known American battles of World War II. Still later, the Australians took on responsibility for containing the bypassed Japanese. And there then ensued what could arguably be called some of the, or possibly the least necessary fighting of World War II. I mean, war is bad enough. When you're having unnecessary warfare, that is something else. So it was a true tragedy. Until now, no single book has covered the entire war in the South Pacific. This account of the stirring actions that were fought there should make it obvious that the South Pacific was indeed one of the great battlegrounds of World War II. James Jones's complaint about our national memory does not have to stand as the final verdict. And now, in words and pictures, I'd like to, in brief, tell you the story of that war. The one South Pacific battle that almost everybody knows, at least by name, is Guadalcanal. The Marines landed there in August of 1942 to seize an unfinished airstrip from which the Japanese threatened to sever our communications with Australia. In the next months, the Japanese attacked on land, sea, and in the air to reclaim the island. This drawing depicts the desperate fighting on Edson's Ridge when the Japanese nearly broke through the Marine lines to retake the airfield. And the war at sea was equally brutal. This photo that was taken during the Battle of Santa Cruz shows Japanese planes swarming around the carrier Hornet and ultimately sinking the ship. After 6 months of fighting, the Americans gained the upper hand, controlled the surrounding waters, cut the Japanese line of supply, and forced them to evacuate Guadalcanal. While that battle was in progress, Australian and American troops fought the Japanese on New Guinea. After landing on the northeast coast at Buna, the Japanese crossed the Owen Stanley Mountains with the objective of taking Port Moresby. Port Moresby is on the south coast of New Guinea and just across from Australia, and from there they could directly threaten Australia. The Japanese were halted by the Australians at the Kokoda Trail, and they were pursued back to Buna. The American 32nd Division was given the task of taking Buna. These half-trained and under-equipped troops suffered heavily during the fighting so that the place became called Bloody Buna. This photo is rather famous. It was the first one during the war that was passed by the censor that showed American troops dead. Despite what the appearances might be here, the Marines, or soldiers, I should say, these are U.S. Army men, did not land from the water. They came in through the jungle and they were cut down on the beach. In early 1943, about the time that the Japanese evacuated Guadalcanal, they were cleared from the eastern end of New Guinea. Then, after a pause to prepare, the Allies began an unstoppable march that won the South Pacific in just 9 months. We'll now look at the top Allied leaders in the South Pacific. On the left is someone who should need no introduction. General Douglas MacArthur was in overall command of the South Pacific, and he's seen here with Admiral Chester Nimitz. MacArthur makes many mistakes early in the war, but he learns how to win by maneuvering and avoiding frontal attack. He vowed no more Bunas, and he mostly kept his word. MacArthur is brilliant, but also very egotistical. In his conceit and his political ambitions, he was much like Union General George B. McClellan of Civil War fame. Unlike McClellan, he had the will and the ability to gain victory. Admiral Bull Halsey commanded all Allied forces in the Solomon Islands. In an unusual arrangement, he served two masters. He was directly responsible to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pearl Harbor, and he was also subordinate to MacArthur for strategic purposes. He was known to have said privately, "Yeah, I could work for Doug MacArthur, but he sure as hell could never work for me." Halsey was appointed when the Marines were in danger of being driven off Guadalcanal. He called that assignment the hottest potato they ever handed me. His biographer described Halsey this way: he was a swashbuckler of the old tradition, like many swashbucklers, part little boy who never grew up. Halsey personified the fighting Navy for the home front and the fighting men alike. In the South Pacific, he fought the war, not aboard a ship, as we see here, but from behind a desk at Noumea, at New Caledonia. And now we come to one of the most controversial commanders of all in World War II. Leading the Australian troops was General Thomas Blaney in the foreground. For many Australians, he's a national hero, the only native-born Australian who attained the rank of Field Marshal. For others, however, he was viewed as a brutal, heavy-handed commander who fired perfectly competent generals, kowtowed to MacArthur, and got men killed for no good reason. And a propensity for heavy drinking and womanizing did not help his reputation. Alan Brooke, Britain's chief of the Imperial General Staff, he wrote in his diary, quote, "Blamey looks entirely drink-sodden, as if he had the most frightful hangover from a debauched night." American General Robert Eichelberger is in the back of the Jeep. MacArthur had ordered him, "I want you to take Buna or don't come back alive." In his letters home, Eichelberger calls his very dramatic boss Sarah, as in Sarah Bernhardt. Eichelberger complained that, although MacArthur never went near the front at Buna, quote, "he leaves the impression with the people back home that he has been the one who has been doing the front line fighting himself. He just wants all the credit." Early in 1943, the Japanese organized a major convoy to reinforce their bases on New Guinea. Having broken their code, we know their plans and we're ready for them. Here we see Allied planes that are closing in on the convoy. They managed to sink all 8 enemy transports plus 4 destroyers. MacArthur's Air Commander General George Kenney carefully planned what was called the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. Kenney developed new bold tactics, and under his tutelage, MacArthur became one of the most air-minded commanders in World War II. Later, MacArthur acquired an equally innovative amphibious commander in Admiral Dan Barbie. Kenney and Barbie often clashed. They were both strong-minded individuals, but together they pulled off some of MacArthur's greatest victories. And there'd be another important coup. We learned that Japan's chief strategist, Admiral Yamamoto, was going to be visiting a forward base in the Solomon Islands. After approval was obtained from Washington, we set out to knock his plane down. In the longest fighter interception mission of the war, 16 P-38 Lightnings flew 600 miles to intercept his aircraft. This is the last known photo of Yamamoto before his fatal flight. The remains of his bomber are presently a tourist attraction in the Bougainville jungle. In early 1943, Halsey's forces held Guadalcanal. It's here, while MacArthur's were principally here in the Buna area. Here's Buna. MacArthur's great goal was to return to the Philippines, and there we're talking way off in this direction, up here. The great obstacle was the Japanese base of Rabaul. And Rabaul is going to be pretty much the center of our story from here on. And all Japanese power is radiating through this whole region from Rabaul. MacArthur's plan was codenamed Cartwheel. It was designed to encircle Rabaul through a series of operations during an 8-month period. With each step forward, airstrips would be developed from which fighter planes could support the next step forward. Halsey's forces would advance from Guadalcanal to New Georgia, and then in turn up to Bougainville at the top of the chain. And these operations are going to involve a few other places that I'm going to mention. One is Rendova. Remember, Rendova is here just this direction from New Georgia. I'll be mentioning Kolombangara. Here's Kolombangara, this little round island sitting just on top of New Georgia. And then a little further on, there's this island, Vella La Vella. So try to bear those in mind as we go forward. Meanwhile, on New Guinea, Americans would land at Nassau Bay. So they're going to be landing here at Nassau Bay. There are already Australian troops that are inland fighting in here. And we're going to be joining up with them, and we're going to be advancing on the Japanese base of Salamaua. After Salamaua, the targets will be Leyte over here, and then Finschhafen out here. And this is called the Yuan Peninsula. And Finschhafen is out here at the tip of the Yuan Peninsula. That's going to be another key target. Afterwards, we're going to move over here. That is going across these narrow straits to take Cape Gloucester. And the whole purpose of that is so that we can get safe passage to proceed in here into the Bismarck Sea, because this is the way forward up to the Philippines. In this way, Rabaul would be surrounded. It was then assumed that, It was then assumed that Rabaul would need to be captured in later operations. Fortunately, that proved unnecessary, as the base was heavily defended and the losses would have been very great. Before we leave this map, I want to point out 4 places outside the boundaries of Cartwheel that we will be talking about. Here on New Guinea, we're going to be talking about Wewak. Here is Aitape, and further up, Hollandia. And one other place that we'll get into the story is up here. This is the Admiralty Islands. This was not part of Cartwheel, but we're going to be picking them up before the story is over. Halsey began his part of Cartwheel with the invasion of New Georgia. Just one Green Army division, the 43rd Infantry, was given the assignment with the 37th Division in reserve. The invasion started with a landing on nearby Rendova Island. The situation looks tense in this photo, however, there were probably few or possibly no Japanese that were actually around. In the South Pacific, we would generally able to find places where we could land, where there were not many Japanese. It was very different from the situation in the Central Pacific, where we had to go in over very heavily defended beaches. After this easy start, the campaign broke down when the Green troops came up against first-class Japanese fighters led by this highly resourceful and imposing-looking general, General Noboru Sasaki. After Halsey learned that the attack was in complete disarray, he immediately conferred with Lieutenant General Millard Harmon. Harmon is seen here behind the wheel of the Jeep. He is the commander of all Army and Army Air Force troops in the South Pacific. He also functioned as Halsey's deputy. In the helmet behind Harmon is Major General Oscar Griswold, who is the commander of the Army's 14th Corps. Although Griswold commanded the two divisions that were fighting on New Georgia, he had not as yet participated in the battle. He was now ordered by Harmon to take over, and he finally won New Georgia, but only after much more heavy fighting and the commitment of another division. Several nighttime battles involving cruisers and destroyers took place in the waters off New Georgia. The Japanese excelled at this fighting, and they were equipped with superb long-lance torpedoes. The Japanese won most of these engagements. After this badly fought campaign, Halsey scored an outstanding success. The plan called for capturing the airfield on nearby Kolombangara Island, but Sasaki had 12,000 troops, and Halsey wasn't interested in another slow and bloody campaign. Instead, he leapfrogged to the island of Vella Lavella, which was 15 miles further up the Solomons, where there were few Japanese. Here we see New Zealand troops in their very distinctive hats going ashore on Vella Lavella. In lockstep with Halsey, MacArthur's forces began their part of Cartwheel by landing unopposed at Nassau Bay on New Guinea. They then joined up with Australian troops that were advancing on Salomaua by land. Later on, you will not see many cases of Australians and Americans operating together. MacArthur hated the idea of having American troops serve under a foreign general, and so he organized the American troops in a separate task force that was called Alamo Force, removing them from Blaney's control. MacArthur's decision to separate the Americans and the Australians actually made sense, as there were many disputes that occurred between the two forces at the command level. For example, the Americans were insistent on highly detailed operational plans, while the Australians relied on their commanders to make the correct moves as the situations developed. Throughout the book, you're going to get constant situations where the two sides do come into conflict. At this point, in mid-1943, the Australians on New Guinea belonged to two superb divisions. The 7th and the 9th Divisions had fought against Rommel in the desert. They were the desert rats of Tobruk and the victors at El Alamein. Brought home to Australia and retrained, they switched from fighting in the African desert to mountainous jungle. The most important objective on New Guinea was the Japanese base of Leyte, to the north of Salomaua. While the Japanese were kept busy by the fighting below Salomaua, Allied forces landed behind them, east and west of Leyte. In the most spectacular airborne operation of the Pacific War, 1,700 Americans jumped into a remote area west of Leyte to capture an abandoned airstrip. MacArthur came too, in a bomber, with a motion picture cameraman to publicize his presence. With the airstrip secured, Kenny flew in the 7th Australian Division. Meanwhile, at the coast, east of Leyte, Admiral Barbie, remember Barbie is the amphibious commander, Barbie landed the Australian 9th Division. The two divisions then raced for Leyte. When it seemed certain that the 9th Division was going to win the race, a patrol from the 7th Division slipped into town. Tongue-in-cheek, their commanding general, George Vesey, signaled to his counterpart of the 9th Division, "Have occupied Leyte, prevent your troops engaging my troops." In the book, I have included stories of many heroic actions, and here's one from the Australian advance on Leyte. Using a machine gun, grenades, and a Bren gun, Private Richard Kelleher, on his own initiative, repeatedly charged and finally eliminated a position that was holding up his unit. He then braved heavy fire to rescue his wounded section leader. Earlier, Kelleher was court-martialed for cowardice, which he denied and vowed to prove untrue. For his courage, Kelleher was awarded the Victoria Cross and participated in the Great Victory Parade in London at war's end. And here we see the King of England stopping to talk to Kelleher on that occasion. These are some of the Australian commanders. Second from right is Major General George Vesey, who led the 7th Division into Leyte. And our right is Lieutenant General Leslie Morshead, the Corps commander. Highly demanding, Morshead was known by his name as Ming the Merciless, after the arch-villain in the Flash Gordon comic strip. And here we have some of those hardy Australian troops dug in on a razorback called Shaggy Ridge during the Yuan Gulf campaign. These Australian operations are largely missing from our military histories. While MacArthur's New Guinea campaign is hailed as a military classic, little attention is given to the Australian victories that formed an essential part of it. After New Georgia and Vella Lavella, Halsey was ready to leap to Bougainville at the top of the Solomon Islands chain. It would be a Marine operation under a new Corps commander, Major General Charles Barrett. Here we see Halsey holding the order, appointing Barrett on the right as commander of the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps. At left in the photo is Major General Archer Vandergrift, the outgoing Corps commander who was leaving for Washington to become the new Marine Corps Commandant. On the other side of Halsey is Harmon, who we already met on New Georgia. While Bougainville was still being planned, Barrett fell to his death from a window of his headquarters building. A court of inquiry ruled his death an accident. In 2007, I discovered top-secret correspondence that told what really happened. That story, which my book tells in full, was concealed through an elaborate cover-up that was approved by Halsey. After Barrett's death, Vandergrift briefly returned to take charge of the Bougainville invasion. And here we see the landing boats circling before their runs to shore, and then the Marines engaged on the beach. Although there were fewer than 300 Japanese in the area, they were determined fighters, so that Bougainville became one of the most hotly contested beachheads of the war in the South Pacific. The aerial photo at the bottom was taken several weeks after the invasion. In the upper part of the photo is the shoreline of Bougainville, where most of the troops landed. In the foreground is Puruata Island, where landings were also made on the northern shore. And incidentally, it is where the photograph of Cochran on the book jacket comes from. He was fighting on Puruata Island that day. We know this photograph dates from several weeks after the landings, because right here you can see the airstrip. Here's the airstrip that the Seabees hacked out of the raw jungle. One Marine gave his impression of what he found on shore. He said it was like running across 30 feet of the Sahara and suddenly dropping off into the Everglades. The Marines discovered what lay behind the beaches, an extensive swamp. That was one major reason why there were so few Japanese in the area. They didn't expect we would land in such a god-awful place. Another Marine who later fought on Guam and on Iwo Jima said, "Nothing compared to Bougainville for miserable living conditions. The closest thing to hell I ever saw in my life." And yet I come across similar things being said about other places and during other campaigns, and I think it's an open question as to which one was the worst. South Pacific was just plain bad. We now come to what Halsey called the most desperate emergency during his time in the South Pacific. The Japanese assembled 7 heavy cruisers to attack our beachhead. They had powerful 8-inch guns, and Halsey had nothing at all that could compare with that. But he had 2 aircraft carriers under the Navy's most aggressive carrier commander, Admiral Ted Sherman. We knew the Japanese ships would refuel at Rabaul. They'd be vulnerable to air attack at that point. It'd be very dangerous to run in 2 carriers that close to a great Japanese base, but it was a risk that had to be run. Halsey later said, "I sincerely expected both air groups to be cut to pieces and both carriers stricken, if not lost." This sight on the left greeted the pilots when they arrived over the harbor. 40 to 50 ships, many of them dashing to try to get through the harbor exit. The photo was taken from an Avenger aircraft, piloted by Commander Henry Caldwell, who coordinated the raid from high above the harbor. During the battle, his photographer was killed and his turret gunner was wounded. Caldwell made it back to the carrier Saratoga, landing on 1 wheel and with no flaps, aileron, or radio. In this well-known photo on the right, Caldwell's gunner is being lifted from the turret of the aircraft, and it's glad to say that we know that he fully survived. As a matter of fact, there's an interesting photograph showing him back in uniform looking at a blow-up of this iconic photo. Although none of the cruisers were sunk, 4 were severely damaged, which forced the Japanese to abandon their plans to go on to attack Bougainville. At the bottom, we see Admiral Sherman getting the good news. He hailed the raid as a second Pearl Harbor in reverse. And there would be another momentous victory at sea. 5 destroyers, commanded by Captain Arleigh Burke, encountered an equal-sized force of Japanese destroyers. 3 enemy destroyers were sent to the bottom without loss. Fittingly, the Battle of Cape St. George, which signified that Japanese dominance in destroyer operations had finally ended, was fought on Thanksgiving Day of 1943. Here we see Arleigh Burke in profile reading on the bridge of his destroyer. Note near the bottom the little beaver insignia, the mascot and nickname of Burke's destroyer squadron, which was adopted from the Red Ryder comic strip. 4 days after the invasion, Bull Halsey visited Bougainville. We see him here literally unbuttoned, tattooed, and looking every inch the old sea dog. During his visit, he conferred with his commanders, including General Roy Geiger, who took over from Vandegrift, who at last was able to head for Washington to take over as the new Marine Corps Commandant. War dogs were first used in the Pacific on Bougainville. Here we see the handlers with Doberman Pinschers and German Shepherds. One German Shepherd, appropriately named Caesar, was wounded in action. He received a commendation from the Marine Commandant, and he was promoted from private first class to sergeant. In the month after the invasion, the 3rd Marine Division fought many actions. They advanced just far enough to obtain a small secure perimeter in which 3 airstrips were built. In mid-December of 1943, the Marines turned over the defense of that perimeter to Griswold's 14th Corps, and they departed. Halsey's bon voyage message to Geiger read, "You have literally succeeded in setting up an opening for business a shop in the Japs' front yard. By front yard, he meant within fighter plane range of Rabaul. It would now be left up to Halsey's air forces to operate the shop and to the Army defending Bougainville, the Bougainville perimeter, to make sure that it stayed open for business. Until November of 1943, Kenny's air forces on New Guinea fully participated in the air attack on Rabaul. Kenny called this attack on the day after the Bougainville invasion the toughest, hardest fought engagement of the war. Rabaul had just been heavily reinforced by planes from the Japanese carrier fleet, and we took heavy losses with little gain that day. The smoke in the background, incidentally, is a smoke screen that we laid down to help us. It hindered more than helped because it created problems in target selection. We didn't do very much. After airstrips were built on Bougainville, most of the bombing of Rabaul was carried out from there and from other Solomon's fields. The aviators included Air Ace Pappy Boyington, who was shot down over Rabaul. Fished out of the water by a Japanese sub, he became a prisoner of war, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor at the end of the war. Cartwheel called for a landing at Cape Gloucester on the western end of New Britain, across the straits from New Guinea. On the map, it looks like a critical choke point. However, since the Japanese were unable to bring long-range guns to the area, they could not have interfered with Allied ship movements. But Macarthur and others believed that possession of Cape Gloucester was necessary to ensure safe passage into the Bismarck Sea before heading for the Philippines. For the invasion, Macarthur obtained the 1st Marine Division. No Japanese opposed these Marines who are wading through the surf. However, much like on Bougainville, there was a miserable, extensive swamp behind the beaches to make life hard for those Marines. The airfield at the Cape was taken with relative ease, but elsewhere the Marines did encounter strong resistance. The campaign ended with the Japanese abandoning most of the island and retreating to Rabaul. Worst of all were the conditions on New Britain. The monsoon began on the invasion day, bringing fierce winds and incessant rain. Many were crushed by falling trees and electrocuted by lightning strikes. Historian Samuel Eliot Morrison commented, "Nature proved to be a worse enemy than the Japanese." Back on Bougainville, 2 National Guard divisions took over from the Marines, the Admiralty and the 37th Infantry Division. At the time of the landings, it was believed that the Japanese would need 3 to 4 months before they could attack in strength. Knowing that it was just a matter of time, Griswold's 2 divisions did everything possible to prepare. They would face General Hirokichi Hyakutake, who had led the Japanese on Guadalcanal, and he hoped to gain the victory this time around. Over jungle pathways, he assembled the greatest concentration of Japanese infantry and artillery that would fight at one place in the South Pacific. So confident was he of victory, his map showed where the surrender ceremony would be held. In their opening attack, the Japanese hit the center of the perimeter, Hills 700. This photo that was taken before the battle shows the hill's steep 65 to 75% grade. The Japanese massed at the foot of the hill, where our guns could not reach them. As the historian of the 37th Division put it, it was difficult to reach an enemy hiding literally under the front lines. During the night, in fog and driving rain, crawling with their rifles slung across their backs, the Japanese worked their way up the slope. They stormed the saddle of the hill, yelling and singing in English to unnerve the defenders, and they overran several American pillboxes in the next hours. That was the beginning of a brutal 3-week battle. Most of the fighting was on the 37th Division front. But the Admiralty Division was involved too, when the Japanese seized the key hill beyond the perimeter. What made the hill special was a 150-foot-tall banyan tree that provided a panoramic view of the countryside. that banyan would be called the most expensive tree in the world. As you might expect, it did not survive the fighting. Near the end of the battle, you have this unusual sight, a division commander in the middle of the action. That's General Baitler, the 37th Division commander, who wrote to his wife, "I had more fun than I ever had in a battle." Griswold and Harmon didn't appreciate him risking his life, but they gave him a Silver Star anyway. The battle ended with the Japanese too battered to ever take the offensive again. In what had become a backwater of the Pacific War, few noticed, and far fewer now remember, this hard-won victory by the citizen soldiers of Ohio, Massachusetts, and Illinois. After the American Joint Chiefs of Staff decided it was unnecessary to capture Rabaul, they replaced it with the Admiralty Islands. The attraction was a fleet anchorage as superb as Rabaul's. Plans to go there were accelerated when aircraft detected no signs of the enemy. In fact, thousands of Japanese were still there playing possum. MacArthur's intelligence chief was sure the Japanese were still there, but Kenny urged MacArthur to take quick action. MacArthur agreed, and referring to Rabaul, he exclaimed, "That will put the cork in the bottle." That is, that should fully surround Rabaul. A reconnaissance force was quickly organized by the 1st Cavalry Division. MacArthur went along to decide on the spot if the troops would stay or be withdrawn, and it made for a good photo op as well. Here we see MacArthur with Admiral Kincaid, his naval commander, aboard the cruiser Phoenix. After these first troopers made it to shore against light opposition, MacArthur ordered them to stay, and he called in the rest of the division. Over the next months, after much heavy fighting, 1st Cavalry Division won the Admiralty Islands. The isolation of Rabaul was essentially complete. Even before then, the Japanese recognized that the South Pacific was lost. It had long since become too dangerous for ships to operate there. Then, unable to afford the further attrition of aircraft in defense of Rabaul, they abandoned the skies to the Allies. Cartwheel's objectives were fully achieved in a remarkable chain of successes that are summed up in the official U.S. Army history. In less than 1 year, MacArthur's and Halsey's forces fought their way from Guadalcanal and Buna through Woodlock, Kirrawina, Nassau Bay, New Georgia, Leyte, Salamaua, Nadzab, the Markham and Ramu Valleys, Finschhafen, the Treasuries, Empress Augusta Bay, Aroe, Cape Gloucester, Sidor, the Green Islands, Emerald, and the Admiralties. Obviously, James Jones got it wrong by saying that there were no great victories. To historian Eric Bergerud, the Japanese defeat in the South Pacific was even more consequential than El Alamein and Sicily for the Germans. In long-term impact, he considered it the equivalent of Stalingrad. With the South Pacific won, Halsey returned to sea. He then made serious errors at Leyte Gulf and in 2 typhoons that cost many lives, and that has seriously harmed his reputation with historians. But in the bloody bookkeeping of war, there's much to counterbalance those losses in his outstanding performance in 20 months in the South Pacific. It was leadership in the mold of the great captains of history, for which he rightly deserves a place among our military giants. Thousands of Japanese remained on Bougainville, New Guinea, and New Britain. Just as they had reignited the fighting on Bougainville, the Japanese struck back on New Guinea. These troops had endured incredible hardships and long retreats through the towering mountains of the Yuan Peninsula. Their commander, fierce-looking General Hitazo Adachi, then led them back to defend their base at Wewak. But they were left far behind when MacArthur leapfrogged past Wewak to land at Aitape and Hollandia. Adachi was then ordered to remain in place in eastern New Guinea, but he was too much of a fighter to accept that decision. Instead, he pressured his higher headquarters for authority to attack MacArthur's rear at Aitapi. Unlike Bougainville, where the Americans mostly let the Japanese batter themselves against the defenses, the American forces fought them face to face in the jungle. Even though MacArthur had promised no more Bunas, he broke that promise to get the battle over as quickly as possible. After a month of heavy fighting, Adachi led his shattered army away. Like the Japanese on Bougainville, Adachi's army lost its offensive ability. Completely isolated, the two armies could do no more than grow their own food and try to stay alive. On Bougainville, as an experiment, African-American troops were used in combat for the first time. Although Green troops often did not do well in their first exposure to combat, the unraveling of one company of 93rd Division troops during a minor jungle clash led the War Department to end the practice. Yet other African-American troops performed well, including these men from the 24th Infantry Regiment. After the war, the American military faced up to the impossibility of obtaining top performance from a segregated army and integrated the armed forces. In October of 1944, MacArthur returned to the Philippines. Needing as many men as possible there, he freed up American troops by substituting Australians to contain the bypassed Japanese. Those Australians inherited an unspoken truce. The Australians in the South Pacific in 1945 were militiamen, commanded by Lieutenant General Vernon Sturdy. Blaney instructed him, by offensive action, destroy enemy resistance as opportunity offers. Sturdy responded with perfect good sense, noting, the Japanese garrisons are virtually in POW camps, but feed themselves, so why incur a large number of Australian casualties in the process of eliminating them? The reason Blaney gave was this, quote, the undesirability of retaining troops in a perimeter, which is certain to destroy the aggressive spirit. Happy hands are busy hands. The least necessary fighting of the Pacific War then began. Little happens on New Britain because there were too many well-supplied Japanese around Rabaul. But there's heavy fighting on Bougainville and New Guinea. Here on Bougainville, aggressive Brigadier Heathcote Hammer is explaining his plans for the offensive to General Sturdy. Meanwhile, on New Guinea, Australian troops took Wewak and they cleared the entire coast. By August of 1945, the Australians had forced the Japanese back to last stand positions on Bougainville and on New Guinea. They then prepared for the final battles, during which the Japanese would certainly have sold their lives dearly. Thankfully, before the two offensives could resume, the pointless conflict ended with the surrender of Japan. Separate surrender ceremonies were held in the South Pacific. The surrender of Rabaul was conducted on board a British aircraft carrier that was anchored nearby. On Bougainville, the surrender was signed by General Masatani Kanda, at left, who took over from Hyakutake, who had suffered a stroke months before. You'll notice an American Marine officer in the back row, second from right, who must have felt particular satisfaction. That's Lieutenant Colonel John Corsi, who had served on the battleship Arizona. In a remarkable conclusion to the proceedings, the Japanese delegation formed ranks and performed a silent bowing ceremony, honoring the dead on both sides. And lastly, here is that relentless fighter, Adachi, handing over his sword on New Guinea. Adachi later received a life sentence for the mistreatment and execution of prisoners, but he chose suicide instead. This most tenacious of Japanese commanders left a note declaring himself worthy of death, not for the actions for which he was convicted, but for not achieving victory. And I'm now going to violate the rules of book promotion by giving away the ending. With the end of the war, each man needed to find peace on his own terms. Blaney left no question about his feelings when he presided over the capitulation of the Japanese Second Army. He told the Japanese, "In receiving your surrender, I do not recognize you as an honorable and gallant foe." But others felt differently. None of the Australian brigadiers was more fiercely anti-Japanese than Arnold Potts. Placed in charge of Bougainville and its prisoners, Potts ordered a full-dress inspection that included 17 Japanese generals and 15 admirals. It was wondered how he would react. To everyone's surprise, at the conclusion of the proceedings, Potts exclaimed, "Good show," and shook hands with the conquered. He would explain, "Many dreadful things have been done during the course of the war, by both sides. There should not be recriminations after the event. Once it was over, it was over." Thank you. And questions? Any questions? Yes. Yes.
So, it was during this time in the Solomons that John F. Kennedy
Right.
right?
Yes. And that was off New Georgia. And it was one of these very many sea battles. And there are several that are chronicled in the book. The Japanese win most of them. The Japanese are much better at this stuff than we are, and they've got much better torpedoes, and it's a long while before we can become their equals. Yes, sir.
Hopefully I stand corrected. Was the premier battleship of Japan the Yakamoto? And where was it sank? I can't remember. Vaguely there was.
That happened. Yeah, wait. Okay. Here in the South Pacific, I think it's only the Kirishima that is sunk. Oh, wait. There was a second one along with the Kirishima that gets sunk off Guadalcanal. And then you're talking about at the very end of the war, and you talk about the Yamato, I think. I think the Yamato was their super battleship, and that happens much later in the war, and off screen.
I couldn't remember the time frame. Thank you.
Sure. Oh, yes, ma'am.
Can you remind us about what transpired with Macarthur and Truman and why Macarthur said, "I shall return"? And then also, why were these battles so little recognized?
Why are they so little recognized? Okay, I'll try to handle it. First of all, with Truman, we're
Alan,
talking
can you repeat
about
the question?
Yes. Oh, okay. She number one, she had talked about Macarthur and Truman, and of course this happens much later during the Korean War. So we're in a different era and a whole different situation. Macarthur wanted to push the war much further than Truman was prepared to go. So, but that lies 6 years beyond the parameters of the story here. Now the second one having to do with Macarthur was.
The second question was, why were these battles
So forgotten? Okay, I would say it's because of everything else that's happening in the world. As I said, at Guadalcanal, we were the only game in town, really, in terms of where our troops were fighting. And it was also a very dangerous situation. When we were fighting on Guadalcanal, and what makes Guadalcanal a lot different from these other campaigns, it was like the war could have gone either way. The Japanese were still quite strong. We had not fully armed yet. And the situation was very tenuous. So, all of these elements came together and it caught people's attention. It was, but I say more than anything else, because until November 8th of 1942, you don't get Americans fighting on land anywhere. That is after our forces surrender. So you have that tremendous concentration to that point. And then afterwards, from there, you've got fighting going on all over the place. And in part, as I said, in the Pacific, once you had Tarawa, and once we start the Central Pacific island hopping there, that war is much more spectacular, and it's over quick. Within a couple of days, usually, the Marines will gain control of it, and then they're moving on elsewhere. The pace is a little slower, and it's much more concentrated. as this cockpit is only this little sub-piece of the war. And then, as I indicated, by roughly February or March of 44, that is, here we're talking about a year and a half before the war ends, the South Pacific is essentially conquered by us. And therefore, it's not going to hold the interest of people. It's backwater stuff. Things are still happening, but it has not gotten much attention from historians after that point because they'll go after the main story. But there's a fascinating story that is taking place here that historians either have just hit very lightly or they've just completely ignored. Another impetus for my writing the book, I was very anxious to highlight this Australian aspect of the story, was the business with the death of General Barrett. And I feel like I own the copyright on that one because it was in 2007 that I stumbled upon that story. I'd never written anything before then. Stumbled upon that story and had written a magazine article, and as was kindly indicated, had won the Author of the Year award for it. But that story had never been integrated into any of the histories because the story of Barrett had essentially been written out of the scenarios. Samuel Eliot Morison, in his majestic history of U.S. naval operations, devotes half of one sentence in a footnote to referring to General Barrett, and that's as much attention as he gets. This is a very interesting story, and as much as anything, it's because of the role that Halsey plays in it. We know that Halsey was directly involved in a massive cover-up because we have it in writing. And so having this very interesting aspect, this was part of the impetus to write the book, to be able to bring this forward. It will make interesting reading, and for those of you who buy the book, don't skip the footnotes that go to chapter 10. I had so much to say in that chapter, and so many of those letters were just so unbelievable that I turned up, because these were letters that were written without the expectation that people were going to see them someday. So these people were really unbuttoning themselves, these top leaders, in their letters. So as much as I could, I packed into the footnotes if I couldn't get it into the body of it itself. So don't fail to do that on chapter 10, and you might also think of the book as buying chapter 10 and getting everything else and all the rest. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I've never understood why American leaders thought that the African Americans would not fight well, and they always,
Why they thought that?
they wouldn't put them in fighting units. They used them as cooks and bakers.
That is a very complicated story, and I was very fortunate, and everybody I think is very fortunate, that a very brilliant man called Ulysses Lee has written he was an African-American officer, and he wrote this book called The Employment of Negro Troops. It was part of the official Army history. And he goes into great detail, and I have to follow him because there's nothing better. And he does point out some of the very real problems that you have there. And one of the greatest was the fact that we had different levels of success with units that were officered by white officers versus those that were completely African American at all echelons. And apparently, I think that there was probably not proper time for the preparation of the NCOs and the officers. And among the officers, apparently there was an element of low morale. And you can kind of understand it. These men are coming out of these southern training camps where they're being treated as second-class citizens. And so many of them would, say, what are we fighting for? And, so that, and then you consider that, you get so many of these men are all clustered together, many of them from rural areas, and they say, this isn't my fight, even at these levels. So it's one thing to have a self-selected group like the Tuskegee Airmen. And often we look at that and say, well, if we could do it there, that was different. Those men had made this very, rational decision. It wasn't like a bunch of, these are largely conscripts, people who are being drafted into the Army. And it's a very, very different situation. My book does try to deal with that to a fair degree, but there's nothing like going to the complete, very, very detailed story that Lee has written in his book.
Well, you have the 10th Cavalry at Fort Riley, Kansas,
Mhm.
led by white officers. So you had, there you had
Yes.
African American NCO.
Right.
And I understand there was a unit, all-black unit in World War I that fought very well. I think it must have been strictly racial prejudice.
Well, it was the units that were the 27th Infantry Regiment, I think, and I talk about that in the book. They were also on Bougainville. They had white officers, and they did just fine. It was a good unit. And the Secretary of War, Stimson, had made the decision that during time of war, they just did not have enough white officers available that they could take over and do it. I think, net, I think it's just as well that things did not work out because it made for, I think, post-war pressure. And the Army, had to come to grips with the fact that this just ain't working with the way they have organized things. So, I like to think that it helped accelerate that whole process of desegregating the armed forces, and that was an important step in changing our society, was to change the situation in the armed forces. Pardon? Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you all.
Folks, we'll see you
And
next